3, 2, 1. Earth below us, drifting, falling,
Hi there, welcome to the Firm Foundation series. My name is Dale Yancy. Today we're on lesson number 20, which is Jacob's son, Joseph, is sold into slavery. I've got my cup of coffee, and you can go grab yours and sit back and join me for this lesson, which I think is going to be really interesting and pretty exciting. You know, for a couple of years in New Hampshire, I did Bible studies on a monthly basis with the prisoners there in the New Hampshire State Prison. And just from that experience, I learned that there were some prisoners that were there unjustly because of false testimony or being railroaded by local law enforcement. And the book, The Innocent Man, and I've got a picture of the book here on the screen. The book, The Innocent Man by John Grisham, it chronicles the true story of a young man who was falsely accused and charged with the rape and murder of a young cocktail waitress, which he did not commit. And he actually ends up on death row due to the deceit on the part of local law enforcement. This is in the state of Oklahoma, and it was not that long ago. But because of the deceitful tricks of the local law enforcement, withholding and mishandling evidence, also the use of junk science and experts that didn't even know what they were talking about, along with a bogus thing called dream confessions, he ends up on death row. Fortunately, they get him off death row, and it's a great book if you haven't read The Innocent Man by John Grisham. Well, the story of Joseph is about a young man who is also falsely accused of a crime and sentenced to prison. But it's also a story about the providential hand of God who's at work behind the scenes, orchestrating his will and his good pleasure. And as we'll see, God knew all along that Joseph was in prison, and God was totally in control. Now, before we go any further, let me remind you that you can go to our website, which is foundationstudy.weebly.com. The address is right here on the screen. You can go there and you can grab the notes and download them for today's lesson or any of our past lessons, as well as viewing the videos of all the lessons up to this point. So check that out. It's foundationstudy.weebly.com. And let's look at the questions from last week's study, which was on Jacob and Esau, the birth of two nations. Question number 1. Before Jacob and Esau were even born, what did God tell Rebekah about the two brothers who were inside the womb? Well, God told her that her two sons in her womb would become two nations, and that from the very beginning they would be rivals. One nation would be stronger than the other, and the older son would serve the younger. And what was the big difference between Esau and Jacob? Well, Esau despised his birthright and spiritual promises of God. Esau was living just for instant gratification, whereas Jacob valued his birthright. He valued the birthright and the promises of God. Jacob believed that God had a great future in store for him. And 3, which son was his father's favorite and why? The answer is Esau, because he liked to be outdoors and hunt just like his father. And 4, what did Esau do with his birthright? The Bible tells us that he despised his birthright. He sold it, or he gave it away just for a bowl of stew because he was hungry. 5, and how did Jacob deceive his father into giving him the blessing that was intended for Esau? He did it with the help and direction of his mother, Rebekah. Jacob cooks a meal of domestic livestock, then he puts on Esau's gamey-smelling clothing to make him, his blind father, think that he's speaking to Esau. Rebekah also puts goatskin pieces on Jacob's arms because he has smooth skin and his brother's very hairy, so that when his father feels the arm, he'll think that he's blessing Esau. And finally, when Isaac asks Jacob directly, "Are you really my son Esau?" Jacob lies and says, "I am." 6. What did Jacob see in the dream given to him by God? He saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and God's angels were walking up and down the ladder, and God stood above the ladder. 7. What did this dream mean? This dream meant that the deliverer, who would be a descendant of Jacob, would be like the stairway connecting the earth to heaven, and through the deliverer, people could be brought back into a oneness or a relationship with God. 8. Later on, Jacob himself is on the receiving end of deception. Which relative deceived him, and how did he deceive Jacob? Well, Jacob flees from his brother Esau to Haran, where he stays with his uncle Laban for the next 20 years. His uncle manipulates and deceives Jacob into working for 14 years in exchange for his daughters, Rachel and Leah. Laban's first deception was tricking Jacob into marrying Leah when he thought he was marrying Rachel. We also learn that Laban changes Jacob's wages 10 different times. 9. In Genesis 32, Jacob wrestles with God all night long. Jacob would not let the angel go until he did what? Until he blessed him. And 10. What was the blessing that Jacob received? Well, he was given a new name, Israel, the one who perseveres with God, and was destined to become the father of 12 tribes and the nation of Israel. 11. Who are Esau's descendants? They're the Edomites, who built their cities in Arabia and are the Middle Eastern people who live today in Iraq, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Morocco, Jordan, and Lebanon. 12. What were the two sons that Rachel gave birth to? Joseph and Benjamin. Finally, 13. What happened to Rachel during the birth of her second son, Benjamin? She died giving birth to Benjamin. Well, Joseph is the fourth generation great-grandson of Abraham, and yet again he's not the eldest. And really, there's a clear pattern here that the natural heir does not receive the blessing. See, God chooses in His grace who receives the blessing, and the pattern has been for it to be one of the younger sons. In one important way, however, the pattern does not continue. You see, there's a great difference between Joseph and the previous 3 generations, because God never calls Himself the God of Joseph, and angels never appear to Joseph, and his 3 brothers are not rejected like those of the other 3. His brothers are included in the godly line of Seth, so there's really not the same contrast to be seen in that respect. Furthermore, Joseph is never spoken to directly by God. He receives dreams and he's given the interpretation of dreams, but he never actually receives communication from God as the other 3 patriarchs do. So it seems that somehow the story of Joseph stands on its own. But why is Joseph different, and why are we being told this story in the Bible? Well, part of the reason is obvious. It's because this story links naturally with the very next book in the Bible, which is Exodus. And in Exodus we find this family enslaved in Egypt, and somehow we need to explain how they got there. The story of Joseph is a vital link explaining how Jacob and his family migrated down to Egypt for the same reason that Abraham and Isaac had gone down to Egypt earlier, because of a shortage of food. You see, Egypt does not depend upon rain since it has a river Nile flowing down from the Ethiopian highlands, whereas the land of Israel depends for its crops totally on rain that's brought by the west wind from the Mediterranean. At the very least, therefore, the story of Joseph is there to link us with the next part of the Bible. But the story of Joseph is not just a link. We're going to see that Joseph is a type of deliverer. He's a picture of what the coming Messiah is going to be like. But the story of Joseph starts here in Canaan. Actually, the story of Joseph begins before Genesis 37. The 12 sons of Jacob were the offspring of 4 mothers, and I show that here on this chart that you can see. And God changed Jacob's name to Israel. The land of Canaan, the promised land, is still called by his name. Now we come to A, Joseph, Jacob's favorite son. Read with me in Genesis 37, verse 1. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things that his brothers were doing. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night, Joseph had a dream. And when he told his brothers about it, they hated him all the more. "Listen to this dream," he said. "We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine." His brothers responded, "So, you think you're going to be our king, do you? Do you actually think you're going to reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way that he talked about them. And soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. "Listen, I've had another dream," he said. "The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me." Now this time he told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers. But his father scolded him. "What kind of dream is that?" he asked. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you?" But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. And here you can see Joseph on the chronological chart. You see that Joseph actually did exist in history. He's a real person, flesh and blood, just like you and me. And he's not some made-up person or a fairy tale, but this is real. We're talking about real life here and a real person that existed in history. Well, Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob. He was 17 years old, and he served his father as a shepherd, and his father also sort of turns Joseph into a tattletale. His father actually has Joseph spying on his brothers all the time. Maybe his father just didn't trust Joseph's brothers, I don't know, but he's got Joseph checking on his brothers and bringing back a report all the time. Joseph brings back a bad report to his father, and in Genesis 37:2, this behavior combined with Joseph's overt favoritism toward Joseph causes his older brothers to resent him to the point of hatred. And because of Jacob's open love for Joseph, his brothers, seeing their father playing favorites with Joseph, they start to despise him. And when Jacob presents Joseph with this highly decorated, this beautiful coat, he's hated and resented by his brothers all the more. And to make matters worse, Joseph displays a lack of wisdom when he begins relaying his dreams, his prophetic visions, showing Joseph one day ruling over his family. The sun, moon, and the 11 stars represented his parents and his brothers. His entire family would one day bow down before him. Now, how would you respond if one of your brothers told you that he had a dream like this? You'd probably think that either he was deluded or he was an egomaniac. Eventually, Joseph's brothers could not even speak to him in a civil manner. But the theme here is that God is everywhere, all the time, and that God knows everything. And for some reason, Joseph was kept at home when his brothers took their father's flocks to graze near Shechem. And Israel became somewhat uneasy about how things were going in Shechem, and his fears were not ill-founded. See, this is where Jacob has purchased some land. It's also a place where Jacob's two sons, Simeon and Levi, killed Shechem, who had raped their sister Dinah. And the men of the city taking the women, children, and cattle of Shechem as spoil. It could certainly be a dangerous place for the sons of Jacob to remain. And so Israel sent Joseph to Shechem to check on his brothers. And we read in Genesis 37, starting verse 12. Soon after this, Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. And when they had been gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing the sheep at Shechem. Get ready, and I'll send you to them." "I'm ready to go," Joseph replied. "Well, go and see how your brothers and the flocks are getting along," Jacob said, "and then come back and bring me a report." So Jacob sent him on his way, and Joseph traveled to Shechem from their home in the valley of Hebron. When he arrived there, a man from the area noticed him wandering around the countryside. "What are you looking for?" he asked. He said, "I'm looking for my brothers," Joseph replied. "Do you know where they are pasturing their sheep?" "Yes," the man told him. "They moved on from here, but I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers to Dothan and found them there. So, as it turns out, Joseph's brothers had moved on to Dothan, nearly 20 miles further to the north. And that really is much more distant from Jacob's watchful eye. But providentially, a man saw Joseph wandering around the fields around Shechem. He just happened to overhear Joseph's brothers saying that they're moving on to Dothan. So Joseph sets out to find them. Again, this is the hand of God, the invisible hand of God. It's God's providence, because Joseph just happens to meet up with a stranger, and this stranger just so happened to overhear Joseph's brothers talking about their plans of what they're going to do next, how they're going to move on further north to Dothan. And so he's able to tell Joseph all this information so Joseph can go and find his brothers. I mean, this is no coincidence. Again, this is the hand of God at work in Joseph's life as well as the life of his brothers. Well, when his brothers looked up and saw someone approaching them from a distance, there was no question who it was. That distinctive multicolored coat with sleeves and everything gave Joseph away. And now we come to B, Joseph sold into slavery. And read with me Genesis 37, starting verse 18. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made their plans to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father that a wild animal has eaten him, and then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. "Let's not kill him," he said. "Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him down into this empty well here in the wilderness, and then he'll die without our laying a hand on him." But you see, Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe that he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and they threw him down into the well. Now the cistern or the well was empty. It was dry. There was no water in it. Then, just as they're sitting down to eat, they looked up and they saw a caravan of camels off in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, What will we gain by killing our brother? His blood would just give us a guilty conscience. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he's our brother. He's our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers, they pulled him out of the cistern and they sold him to the traders for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. Well, sometime later, Reuben returns to get Joseph out of the well. And when he discovered Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief. And then he went back to his brothers and he lamented, The boy is gone. What will I do now? Then the brothers killed a goat. They dipped Joseph's robe in the blood of the goat. And they sent the beautiful robe to their father with this message. Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son? Their father recognized it immediately. Yes, he said, it's my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him. Joseph had clearly been torn to pieces. Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, dressed himself in burlap. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. His family all tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. I will go to my grave mourning for my son, he would say, and then he would weep. Meanwhile, the Midianite traders arrived in Egypt, where they sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was the captain of the palace guard. Well, now the theme here is that man is a sinner. He needs God. He's helpless to save himself. You see, Joseph's brothers had plenty of time to agree among themselves that this was their golden opportunity to get rid of him. At least some of the brothers wanted to kill Joseph and do it right then and there. Reuben did not agree with this plan. He wanted to spare Joseph's life. But it would seem that his motives were all self-serving. He was, after all, the eldest of Israel's sons, and he would be held responsible for not looking after Joseph. So because of this, Reuben sought to spare Joseph's life, and he convinced his brothers to throw Joseph into a nearby cistern, thinking that he would return and free the lad later on. Fortunately, the cistern or the well was dry, so that Joseph would not drown. And again, this is God's providence at work. God was working behind the scenes to make sure that they threw Joseph into a well that was totally dried up. Well, Reuben was gone, perhaps taking his turn at watching the flock of sheep, and his brothers sat down to eat somewhere near the cistern, probably well within hearing distance, so that they ate and they could actually hear the cries for help coming from Joseph. Dothan was on the trading route to Egypt, and it just so happened that as they were eating, they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites drawing near, and the camels were carrying spices, balm, and myrrh. It was at this point that Judah proposed a more profitable solution to their problem. Rather than killing Joseph, why not just sell him as a slave? I mean, they'd get rid of him, and yet they would not be guilty of shedding his innocent blood, and to make it even more tempting as an opportunity, they would make a little money for themselves at the same time. Well, this seemed to accomplish all their objectives much better than just killing Joseph. Since Reuben was not there to object, Judah's suggestion was adopted, so they pulled Joseph out of the well, and they handed him over to the Ishmaelites, who paid them 20 pieces of silver. After initially plotting murder against him, his brothers settled for selling him to a caravan of traders bearing goods through Canaan on their way to Egypt. And the merchants in turn sold Joseph to Potiphar, the captain of the guard, who was an officer of Pharaoh there in Egypt. And here you can see on the map Canaan, Midian, and Egypt on the map here. So this is the area that we're talking about. And again, these Ishmaelite traders are headed south into Egypt. And that's where they're going to be selling Joseph as a slave. Well, sometime later, Reuben returns to the cistern to release Joseph, only to find that he's gone. Reuben reports this to his brothers, and we're not told that they confessed what they had done, but they all tore up Joseph's coat. They dipped it in goat's blood to make it look as though Joseph had been killed and eaten by a wild animal. And coldly, the brothers just thrust this blood-soaked coat into their father's hands, asking him if it was Joseph's garment. And then, Without saying anything, they let their father draw his own false conclusion that Joseph had been killed and devoured by a wild animal. I wonder if there was a certain satisfaction for these sons when they saw their father mourning the loss of his favorite son Joseph. They attempted to console him, but he would not be comforted at all. Now we come to see the price of purity. Genesis 39 verse 1 says, "When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. And Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything they did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master." Potiphar noticed this, and he realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything that he did. This pleased Potiphar, so that he made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything that he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and his livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything that he owned. And with Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. And we're told that Joseph was very handsome and he was a well-built young man. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household, and no one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except for you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." Well, she kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. Well, one day, however, when no one else was around, and he went in to do his work, she came and grabbed him by his coat, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." And Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. When she saw that she was holding his cloak and that he had fled, she called out to her servants, and soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream, he ran outside and got away. But he left his coat behind with me." And she kept his cloak with her until her husband came home. She told him her story. "That Hebrew slave you brought into our house, he tried to come in and fool around with me," she said. Or actually, she probably said he tried to rape me. "But when I screamed, he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and he threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there Joseph remained. Well, Genesis 39 is a refreshing example of sexual purity. You see, Joseph was purchased from the Ishmaelites by Potiphar, a powerful and prosperous man. Potiphar was a servant of Pharaoh, and he owned what appears to be a large and lucrative ranch. And initially, Joseph was probably acquired to work with the flocks. But over a period of time, it became apparent to Potiphar that God's hand was on Joseph, because everything that Joseph touched seemed to turn to gold. And before long, Potiphar had put Joseph in charge of everything that he had. The only decisions Potiphar had to make concerned those things of what he would have for dinner. Well, after some time, Potiphar's wife took a sexual interest in Joseph because he was young, around 17 years old, and he was very good looking. And Joseph's refusal of the wife's advances was articulate and reasonable. She tried in various ways to seduce him, but Joseph did everything he could to avoid her. However, one day, she managed to entrap Joseph in the house alone, where she once again tried to seduce him. He found it necessary to flee half naked, leaving his outer garment, his coat, in her grasp. Notice that Joseph's coat always seems to be getting him into some kind of trouble. She then accused Joseph of attacking her, and Potiphar, her husband, when he came home, had Joseph thrown into prison. Well, Joseph did not have to go far from the executive suite to the prison because they were all in the same house. In those days, prisons were really dungeons under the house of an official like Potiphar. And Potiphar was in fact the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And the prison, as the executive suite, was really God's hand of blessing continuing to be upon Joseph. And now we come to the theme, man must have faith in order to please God and to be saved. You see, the sexual harassment by this woman took place in a power relationship that disadvantaged Joseph. Although she believed that she had the right and power to use Joseph in this way, her words and contact were clearly unwelcome to Joseph. You see, Joseph's work required him to be at home where she was, and yet he could not call the matter to Potiphar's attention without interfering in their marital relationship. Even after his escape and arrest on false charges, Joseph seems to have no legal recourse. But at this point, we can really learn a lot about Joseph's character. He's an incredible example of a godly character to any teenager or to any adult today. Because first of all, notice his reactions as he sinks down the social ladder. His reactions are all first class. There's no trace of resentment. There's no complaining. There's no questioning of God. There's no sense of injustice that he should find himself in prison on death row in Pharaoh's jail. Furthermore, even though he's far from home and totally unknown, he maintains his integrity when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. Now you realize that Joseph could easily have rationalized everything. He could have made a strong case that God is the one who has allowed all this to happen. God allowed for him to be sold as a slave, and now God has placed him in Potiphar's house, and God's now allowing him to be seduced by Potiphar's wife. He could have said to himself, I'll never know what it's like to have sex, and maybe God has arranged this opportunity for me, and I should take advantage of it. I mean, he could easily have thought that. But no, Joseph trusted in God. He did not want to break his promise to Potiphar, who put his trust in Joseph. See, Joseph was totally a man of integrity. He was not about to break that trust or to violate his conscience by sleeping with another man's wife. So even at rock bottom, languishing in jail, his concern seems to have been primarily to help others as he seeks to comfort Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. Joseph is a man who seems to have no concern for himself, but he has a deep concern for everyone else. And we come to D, from prison to the palace. Read with me Genesis 39, verse 19. Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison, and he showed him his faithful love. The Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all his other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. And the warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him, and he caused him everything that he did to succeed. The theme here again is God is faithful. He never changes. The theme also is that God is the God of forgiveness. We forgive others even as we have been forgiven. Well, in prison it would have been very easy for Joseph just to sit around and wallow in self-pity. I mean, thrown into prison, it would have been so easy for Joseph to become embittered and hard-hearted towards his brothers who tried to kill him and ended up selling him into slavery. Joseph also could have held great hatred in his heart towards Potiphar and his wife, who lied and was responsible for his being thrown into prison on trumped-up charges. Joseph could have held all these things in his heart and become full of anger and bitterness, but he chose to forgive. He knew that all these people were being used by God to fulfill his purpose in his life, and he could well have said to himself, what's the good of trusting God and doing what's right? So far it's gotten me nothing but trouble. Instead, Joseph set out to minister to others, and before long, the hand of God was once again evident in Joseph's life. The warden gave Joseph a free hand, putting him in charge of all the prisoners. He virtually ran the prison. So apparently, it seems like Joseph had the gift of administration. I mean, he is an incredible administrator because he's able to keep things in order and really administrate in such a wonderful way that those over him have nothing to worry about. Joseph, again, is a good example to you and I that we need to forgive others and not hold bitterness or anger in our hearts because of things that happen to us. We really need to see that God's in control of everything, and when someone does an injustice to you or I, we need to forgive them the same way that Joseph forgave Potiphar and his wife as well as his brothers. We need to forgive others even as God has forgiven us. I mean, we can't sit around and be judge and jury over others. We need to see that we, both you and I, that we're sinners, and we need a deliverer. And we need to be delivered from our sins and from our unforgiveness. And that's why Joseph shines as a bright light, because he was abused, he was mistreated in every way, but he still chose to forgive. My question is, can we do any less? We come to Genesis 40, verse 1. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them in the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." "Well, interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a grapevine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom, and soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup. Then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." "Well, this is what the dream means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so that he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I had a dream too, and in my dream there were 3 baskets of white pastries stacked on my head, and the top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head." "Well, this is what the dream means," Joseph told him. "The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. And 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole. Then the birds will come and peck away at your flesh." Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. So in prison, Joseph met 2 of Pharaoh's officials who were incarcerated. He met the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. It would have been so easy for Joseph to overlook the suffering of others, especially if you yourself were suffering. Joseph noted that both the butler and the baker were despondent, and so he asked them, "What's troubling you?" Many Egyptian texts mention the role of cupbearers, who not only tasted wine for quality, but they also tasted the wine to detect poison. But the cupbearers also enjoyed proximity to those with political power. They often became confidants who were valued for their counsel. Like chief cupbearers, chief bakers were also trusted, officials who had open access to the highest persons in government and who may have performed duties far beyond that of preparation of food. And the theme here is that God is everywhere all the time, and he knows everything. They both informed Joseph that they had had dreams in the night, but no one could tell them what their dreams meant. Joseph reminded them that interpretations belong to God, and he encouraged them to tell him their dreams. Surely this suggests that they were well aware of Joseph's relationship with God. The butler went first, and Joseph told him that God was about to restore him in favor with Pharaoh. Joseph then asked the butler to remember his unjust treatment and to speak kindly for him with the Pharaoh, so that maybe the Pharaoh would let him out of prison. But the butler forgot all about Joseph for the next 2 years. The baker's dream was different, as was its outcome. His dream indicated that Pharaoh would execute him. And needless to say, Joseph didn't even bother to ask this fellow to remember him before Pharaoh. Now we come to Genesis 41, verse 1. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows coming up out of the river and began grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows coming up behind them from the Nile, but they were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up, but he fell asleep again, and he had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dreams. So he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not a single one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. "Today I have been reminded of my failure," he told Pharaoh. "Some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. And one night the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. And there was a young Hebrew man that was with us there in prison, who was a slave of the captain of the guard. And we told him our dreams, and he told each of us what our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it." "It's beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied. "But God can tell you what it means, and God can set you at ease." So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. "In my dream," he said, "I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows. But afterward you wouldn't have known it, for they are still as thin and scrawny as before. And then I woke up. But then I fell asleep again, and I had another dream. And this time I saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. And then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And the shriveled up heads of grain swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean." Joseph responded, "Both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind, they represent 7 years of famine. And this will happen just as I described it. For God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt, and famine will destroy the land. And this famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God and that he will make them happen very soon. Therefore Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it there so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land." Well, I have a picture here where you can see the map of Egypt with the Nile River. This is the area that we're talking about. And the theme here is that God is supreme and sovereign. Well, Joseph's words were of great comfort and encouragement to Pharaoh, who must have sensed something ominous about his dreams. See, the dreams refer to the same events. There would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of severe famine. The years of famine would consume the abundance of the years of plenty. And the fact that there were 2 dreams confirmed that this would most surely come to pass. Joseph now goes beyond the interpretation of the dreams, and he recommends a solution to the problem that he's predicted. Here we can see Joseph's administrative gifts in action. The king should appoint someone to prepare for this disaster before the years of famine come upon the land of Egypt. And let this person store up grain from the bountiful years and then distribute it during the lean years. Now, I don't think Joseph ever imagined that he would be chosen for such a task. Once again, Joseph is simply trying to serve his king. Notice that Joseph did not even seek to bargain with Pharaoh for his release. He could have said, "Well, Pharaoh, I know that I can interpret your dreams, but you're going to have to help me out as well." He didn't say that. And we come now to Genesis 41, verse 37. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials, So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you clearly, no one else is as intelligent and wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from only you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt." And then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand. He placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing, and he hung a gold chain around his neck. And then he had Joseph ride in the chariot that was reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, his command was shouted, "Kneel down." So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or a foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval." Well, God's presence with Joseph was so obvious that Pharaoh promoted Joseph to second in command of Egypt, especially to take charge of preparations for the coming famine. And God's word to Abraham was bearing fruit. He had told Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." And Joseph's promotion brought him significant accoutrements of leadership, a royal signet ring, gold chain, fine clothing, appropriate to his high office, official transportation, and he was given a new Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife from an upper middle class family. Now think about this. Whenever we make something, it belongs to us, right? And we make choices about how our belongings will be used. I mean, if you bake a batch of cookies, they're yours to, you can keep them, you can give them away, or you can take them to a bake sale. If you erect an apartment building, you decide whether to rent it out or turn it into condominiums or sell it to someone else. Well, you see, God's the creator of all people. He's the giver and sustainer of life. He's the one who made us, and we rightfully belong to him. And God can do whatever he wants to. He can do whatever he wishes with us. And because he's God and he's righteous, everything that he does is always right. Whatever he does to people, it's right. See, God was working through the lives of an Egyptian Pharaoh and an Israelite prisoner on behalf of his people. Because even there in prison, Joseph believed that God's purposes were right for him. Though he did not know at the time how God was going to work, Joseph trusted God. He lived by faith, believing that God would do what was best. And now we come to E. Joseph provides for his family and the future Israel. Read with me Genesis 41, verse 53. At last the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end. Then the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread throughout the land of Egypt as well. And when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he told them, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." So with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. In Genesis 42, verse 1, when Jacob heard the grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise we'll die." So Joseph's 10 older brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain. But Jacob wouldn't let Joseph's younger brother Benjamin go with them, for fear that some harm might come to him. So Jacob's sons arrived in Egypt along with others to buy food, for the famine was in Canaan as well. Since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. And when they arrived, they bowed before him with their faces to the ground. And Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger. He spoke harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "and we've come to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. And he remembered the dreams that he'd had about them many years before. He said to them, "You are spies, and you've come to see how vulnerable our land will become." "No, my lord," they exclaimed. "Your servants have simply come to buy food. We are all brothers, members of the same family, and we're honest men, sir. We are not spies." "Yes, you are," Joseph insisted. "You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become." "Sir," they said, "there are actually 12 of us. We, your servants, are all brothers, sons of a man living in the land of Canaan. Our youngest brother is back there with our father right now, and one of our brothers is no longer with us." But Joseph insisted, As I said, you are spies. This is how I will test your story. I swear by the life of Pharaoh that you will never leave Egypt unless your younger brother comes here. One of you must go and get your brother. I'll keep the rest of you here in prison, and then we'll find out whether or not your story is true. By the life of Pharaoh, if it turns out that you don't have a younger brother, then I'll know that you are spies. So Joseph put them all in prison for 3 days. And on the third day Joseph said to them, I am a God-fearing man. If you do as I say, you will live. If you really are honest men, choose one of your brothers to remain in prison. The rest of you may go home with grain for your starving families. But you must bring your youngest brother back to me, and this will prove that you're telling the truth, and you will not die. To this they agreed. So the dreams which God had given Joseph as a young man were about to be fulfilled, because God always does what he says. And the theme here is that God is faithful. He never changes. And here you see a picture of Joseph's brothers bowing before him. See, all the sons of Jacob, they make their way to Egypt, minus Benjamin. Jacob had lost one of Rachel's sons while he was out of his sight and in the care of his brothers, and he's not willing to run the risk of losing another. So when the 10 sons of Jacob, they come before Joseph, the ruler of the country, they fall down before him, unwittingly fulfilling the prophecy that Joseph had in those early dreams. Many are tempted to see Joseph's response as just pure revenge, harshness. It's thought to be his way of making his brothers pay for their previous sins against him. But we really can't accept this view because the text is really very clear on this matter. See, first of all, if Joseph really wanted to make his brothers suffer, he would have immediately made his identity known to them. If Joseph had wanted to terrify his brothers, he would let them know that it was he who was ruler of Egypt, and then he would have made them suffer. Second, we're told that while his brothers did not recognize Joseph, that he recognized them, and he remembered his dreams. Now, I understand this meant to Joseph, he not only realized that God had made him leader of his family, but that his leadership should seek the best interests of his family. That it was not revenge that Joseph sought, but repentance. Third, we're told that his harsh treatment of his brothers is a disguise. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But see, he pretended to be a stranger to them. He spoke to them harshly. He asked, "Where do you come from?" And they answered, "From the land of Canaan to buy grain for food." Fourth, on several occasions we find Joseph's true feelings toward his brothers revealed. Twice Joseph has to go aside to weep privately, to cry. Fifth, Joseph's actions towards his brothers were not vindictive but gracious. Twice he sent them home with the grain that they had purchased and with their money refunded there in their sacks. The meal that he prepared for them was another gift of grace. Even the suffering that he caused his brothers was benevolent in its goal because he wanted to bring his brothers to repentance so that they could be reconciled. Joseph's actions towards his brothers in their first and second visits to Egypt are carefully planned. They're orchestrated to bring about his intended results. When Joseph accused his brothers of being spies, they were terrified, and they blurted out information about Joseph's father and younger brother that Joseph yearned to know. And yet, without his brothers realizing who he really was, Joseph could easily interrogate his brothers about family matters under the guise of protecting the land of Egypt from spies. Well, having learned that both Jacob and Benjamin were alive, Joseph sets out to accomplish the next phase of his plan, which is bringing Benjamin down to Egypt. The purpose of this would soon become evident. Joseph's brothers had insisted that there were 10 brothers and that they were not spies and that they had yet another brother at home. Joseph caused it to appear that he was merely putting the truthfulness of their words to the test. They said that they had a younger brother, so let them prove it by bringing him with them the next time they come. And to assure that they did return, he would keep one brother as a prisoner. Initially, Joseph threatened to keep all the brothers in prison and just to send back one brother. But he knew that this would not allow them to transport a sufficient quantity of grain, and so he eventually reduced the number of prisoners to just one, which was Simeon. Well, the response of Joseph's brothers to their incarceration and to Joseph's words is most important to the story. In verse 21, they said to one another, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother, because we saw how distressed he was when he cried to us for mercy, but we refused to listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." Reuben said to them, "Didn't I say to you, don't sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. So now we must pay for shedding his blood." You see, More than 20 years after they had sinned against their brother Joseph, the events of that day were vivid in their minds. They recalled his pleading with them and their total lack of mercy, and they understood that this was kind of a day of reckoning for their sin. I'll submit that they were genuinely sorry for what they had done, but they had not yet come to full repentance, but this was going to come in time. While Joseph was standing nearby, he heard their words, but they had no idea that he could understand what they were saying. See, they're talking in Hebrew, and they think that Joseph can't understand them, but he hears everything they're saying and knows what's going on. He was deeply touched by their words. He had to leave their presence so that he could go and cry. Joseph bound Simeon before their eyes to impress them with his resolve about seeing Benjamin when they returned. He then ordered for their sacks to be filled with grain and for provisions to be supplied for their journey. So the brothers set out on their journey, no doubt discussing what they should tell their father. One of the brothers opened his sack of grain when they stopped for the evening and was shocked to find his money there along with his sack of grain. Now you would think that any son of Jacob would have rejoiced. It would be like putting money into a vending machine, getting what you selected, and then finding your money there in the coin return. But the brothers were greatly dismayed. They looked at one another and they said, "What in the world has God done to us?" They completely failed to see the kindness of Joseph in this, and they saw only the judgmental hand of God. See, God had not done something for them. As far as they were concerned, he'd done something terrible to them. Well, they returned home and they told their father all that happened to them in Egypt. Jacob certainly noticed that Simeon was not with them. They explained why the ruler of Egypt had kept him prisoner. And when their bags were opened, the brothers discovered that every one of them had their money in their sacks, and they were most distressed. But at this point, Jacob could only think of himself. Their father Jacob said to them, "You are making me childless. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Reuben now comes through with these comforting words of assurance. "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care and I'll bring him back to you." Well, there's nothing more to be said regarding this matter, because at the moment, Jacob flatly refused to allow them to take Benjamin with them. In Jacob's mind, there'd be no more discussion about this at all. But after a while, he does relent, and the brothers do return with Benjamin. Well, when Joseph arrives there on the scene, his brothers, they bow before him, once again fulfilling the dreams that he'd had years earlier. And Joseph seems not to even notice their gift, so carefully arranged to capture his attention and win his approval, because Joseph only has eyes for his younger brother Benjamin. Joseph was so touched by the sight of his brother that he has to leave the room again to cry in private. He then washes his face and returns, giving the order, "Set out the food." The servants set out 3 separate tables, one for Joseph, one for his brothers, and one for the Egyptians who ate with Joseph. And Joseph seats his brothers according to their birth order, which must have amazed, it must have freaked them out. Like, how could he know? It was a royal feast, and I'm sure that Joseph's brothers, who had run out of grain sometime earlier, would have appreciated it. I'm also certain that they could eat all that they wanted, but Joseph did something that was most unusual. He made Benjamin's portions 5 times greater than those of his other brothers. In preparation for the test ahead, Joseph was not going to minimize the fact that Benjamin was a favorite son of Jacob. Indeed, he wanted to emphasize this fact. So by the time the meal was over, they had their fill of both food and drink. I have a feeling that this was to give his brothers an artificial sense of confidence and to dull their senses for the moment. So Joseph gave very careful instructions to his servant. He had him fill his brothers' sacks with grain, once again placing their money in each man's sack. This time, however, one more item was included. It was Joseph's silver cup, and this cup was to be placed in Benjamin's sack along with his money. After the men were sent on their way, Joseph's servant would pursue them and overtake the brothers as they were leaving Egypt. And then they were to be accused of stealing Joseph's cup, the one that he had used for divination. Now, there's no need to be distressed over what we read here. Joseph did not actually use this cup for divination. This was part of the servant's script, which Joseph instructed him to say. It was part of Joseph's disguise. When Joseph instructed his servant to hide this cup in Benjamin's sack, he simply referred to it as a silver cup. But for the sake of his brothers, his servant was to call the cup that his master used as a cup for divination. Joseph wanted to continue this masquerade just a little while longer, and this line in the story helped maintain his disguise. When Joseph's servant overtook the brothers, he did just as his master had instructed him. He accused them of returning evil for good by stealing his master's divining cup. And the brothers are shocked that they would be accused of such a crime. They were confident that none of them had stolen this cup, and so they overreacted to these charges. They prescribed the punishment for themselves should any one of them have stolen this cup. If one of us has it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my Lord's slaves. Joseph's servant then responded to this statement, prescribing what the punishment would be for stealing the cup. He replied, "You have suggested your own punishment. The one who has it will become my slave, but the rest of you will go free." Well, I'm sure that each of these men were extremely confident as they lowered their sacks to the ground and opened it. What a shock it must have been for each man to find his money in the mouth of a sack, just as they had before. It'd be something akin to being pulled over by a policeman and having him search your trunk for money that was stolen in a bank robbery. And confident that you didn't have the money in your car, you pop open your trunk to see the money there along with an automatic weapon. I would imagine that fear began to grip the hearts of each of these men as they discovered their money in their sacks. But the worst was yet to come. When Benjamin's sack was opened, not only was his money found, but also Joseph's silver cup. These brothers, they tore their clothes in anguish. They loaded their animals and they made their way back to face the music before the ruler of Egypt. And when they arrived, Joseph continued his disguise. "What did you think you were doing? Don't you know that a man like me can find out these things by divination?" See, Joseph wanted these men to think that there was nothing about them that he didn't know or could not find out. After all, he had arranged their seating order according to their birth order. And now he had a silver divining cup to which he could discern the truth, or so he claimed. The message was clear. It would do them no good to lie. Well, at this point, Judah assumes the role of leadership. He speaks on his brother's behalf. And Judah replied, "What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? How can we clear ourselves? God has exposed the sin of your servants. We are now my Lord's slaves, we and the one in whose possession the cup was found." But Joseph said, "Far be it from me to do this. The man in whose hand the cup was found will become my slave, but the rest of you may go back to your father in peace." Well, Judah's answer is most interesting and most encouraging. I'm convinced that Judah knew that Benjamin had not stolen this cup, just as each of them had not stolen the money that they had paid for their grain. Judah rightly discerned that this was God's way of dealing with them. So therefore he says, "God has exposed the sin of your servants." See, I don't think Judah meant to say, "We stole money and we stole the silver cup. God knows it and he's exposed our sin." I think Judah's words really meant, "We sold our brother into slavery, something you would not know anything about or appreciate as being a ruler of Egypt, so I won't go into detail. And God is now bringing about our punishment for that sin. And we didn't do what you're accusing us of doing, but we did something far worse. For that we will plead guilty." Thus, Judah both confesses for all his brothers and he submits to the penalty of slavery for all. Now this is real progress for Joseph's brothers, but they've not yet fully manifested true repentance. So Joseph declines Judah's offer. Joseph's response can roughly be paraphrased this way: "Oh no, it would not be fair to punish all of you for the crime that only one of you has committed. The punishment must be to the one in whose sack the cup was found. He shall be my slave, and the rest of you are free to go back home to your families." So now this is the greatest test of their lives. They could seize upon Joseph's words. They could denounce Benjamin for stealing and go home to Canaan as free men, leaving Benjamin as one of Pharaoh's slaves. In effect, they could do to Benjamin exactly what they had done to Joseph. How easy it would have been simply to walk away and leave Benjamin, just as they had forsaken Joseph years earlier. But this is truly Judah's finest hour. He's the one who made himself surety for Benjamin. And now he fulfills his promise to his aged father. Judah steps forward and he asks to speak to the ruler of Egypt. And Judah explained how it had come about that they had told him about their younger brother, Benjamin. Since his older brother is dead, Benjamin is now the only remaining son of his father's wife Rachel. Because he insisted that they bring his younger brother to Egypt, they did so in spite of their father's strong protests. The boy's father is now elderly, and if this son does not return, it will kill their father. Judah told the ruler of Egypt that he had become surety for the lad with his father, and thus he begged him to allow the boy to return to his father and just to take him, Judah, as slave. So Judah begged to take the place of Benjamin in order to spare his brother's life, as well as the life of their father. Judah, the very one who had cast the blood-drenched coat at his father's feet so many years ago, now pleads with Joseph to have compassion on their father, as he does. And we come to F. Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers. And the theme here is that God is supreme and sovereign. Genesis 45, verse 1. Well, Joseph could stand it no longer. There were many people in the room, and he said to his attendants, "Out, all of you." So he was alone with his brothers when he told them who he was. And then he broke down and wept. He cried loudly, so loudly that the Egyptians could hear him, and word quickly carried to Pharaoh's palace. "I am Joseph," he said to his brothers. "Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer, and he said to them, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me into this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years, it will last for 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing or harvesting. And God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he's the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt, so come down to me immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and everything that you own. And I will take care of you there, for there are still 5 years of famine ahead of us. Otherwise, you and your household and all your animals will starve." Then Joseph added, "Look, you can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that I really am Joseph. So go tell my father of my honored position here in Egypt. Describe for him everything that you've seen, and then bring my father here quickly." Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers, and he wept over them. And after that, they began talking freely with him. Well, the theme here is that God is everywhere all the time, and God knows everything. In Genesis 45, verse 7, when he finally made himself known to his brothers, after humbling and embarrassing them greatly, having forgiven them for what they had done to him, he then said, "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you as a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance." You see, Joseph's brothers thought that they had got rid of him by selling him to traveling camel traders as a slave and covering his special coat with blood, the blood of a goat, to trick their father into believing that his favorite son was dead. Yet Joseph could see God's hand was in it. He could look back on his work in Egypt, having been elevated to high office following his interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, that there would be 7 fat years with good harvest and 7 lean years to follow. And by advising that the food should be stored during those plentiful years, he had actually saved the entire nation of Egypt. And now his own family he was saving because his family had become short of food as well. He had become their savior. See, that's why Joseph here, his story is so important, because Joseph is a picture of the coming deliverer, the coming Messiah. God's providence also can be seen in the movement of Joseph's family down to Egypt. Although God had promised the land to them, he had told Abraham many years previously that he would have to leave his family in Egypt for 400 years until the wickedness of the Amorites was complete. God would not allow the family of Abraham to take the promised land from those living in it until they were so dreadful and so evil in everything that they did that they forfeited their right to both the land as well as their lives. You see, God is a moral God. God would not just push one people group out of the land so that he could put his own people in. And archaeology has indicated to us just how evil and dreadful these people were. Venereal diseases were rife in the land of Canaan because of their corrupt sexual practices. Eventually they reached a point of no return, and only then did God say that his people could have their land. So those who really complain about God's injustice in giving the land to the Jews are quite mistaken. God was so patient with the Canaanites, yet because of their evil practices, he allowed judgment to come upon them, and he turned the land over to his people, the Israelites, the Jews. So Joseph then sent his brothers back home to bring their father and their families down to Egypt. informing them that there were yet 5 more years of famine ahead. So the story goes on to describe the arrival of Jacob and his family in Egypt. God provided for them to have a place of their own in the land of Egypt, the land of Goshen, where they could keep their flocks. Eventually they purchased property there and prosper. In this way, God brought Israel, all 70 of them, to Egypt. And now let's do a little bit of review on today's lesson to see what you remember. Question number 1. How did Joseph's older brothers react to their father's love for them? Well, they were jealous and they hated Joseph. 2. What did Joseph dream? Well, Joseph dreamt that he and his brothers were out there in the field tying up bundles of grain, and he said, Suddenly my bundle stood up, and all your bundles of grain gathered around and bowed low before mine. And he also had a dream about the sun and moon and stars. He said, The sun, moon, 11 stars, they bowed low before me. 3. What did these dreams mean? They meant that Joseph would be given a position of authority over his family. 4. Who knew Joseph's future and showed it to him through his dreams? God did. 5. How much of our future does God know? God knows it all. 6. What did Joseph's brothers do to him? Well, first they threw him down into an old well where he might have died. Then they sold Joseph to become a slave in Egypt. 7. What happened to Joseph in Egypt? Well, the wife of Joseph's owner tried to seduce him and get him into bed with her. When her actions were rebuffed by Joseph, she lied about him, and he was thrown into prison. 8. Who took care of Joseph in prison? God did. And 9. Why did God take care of Joseph? Well, A, because although Joseph was a sinner, he trusted in God and God's mercy. B, because Joseph believed God's promises regarding the deliverer. And C, because God had a wonderful plan for Joseph's life. 10. Who gave Joseph the understanding of Pharaoh's dreams? God did. 11. And what did Pharaoh's dreams mean? God was making known to the king that there would be 7 years of very good harvest, which would be followed by 7 years of drought. 12. Is God able to do whatever he wants to do, even in places where people don't know and worship him? Yes. God is able to do whatever he wants to do because he's Almighty God. 13. How did God fulfill his dreams which he had given to Joseph when he was a youth? Well, the Lord gave Joseph wisdom to interpret the king's dreams so that Joseph would be given the position next to the king. And 14. Why did Jacob take all of his family to live in Egypt? Well, A, because his son Joseph was down in Egypt. B, because there was plenty of food in Egypt. C, because the king invited Joseph to live in Egypt. And D, because God had planned for this to happen. And 15. What were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's descendants called? They're called the children of Israel, Israelites, or Israel. And 16. What motivated Joseph to act as he did? And the answer is his faith in God. Well, next week we're going to look at lesson number 21, where God preserved Israel, which was enslaved in Egypt. We're also going to see the providential hand of God in the life of Moses. That's lesson 21. That'll be next week. And until then, I hope you have a great week, that the blessing of God be upon you and your family. And I'll join you next time here for lesson 21 in the Firm Foundation series. Until then,